Good afternoon and welcome to Science Sundays. Science Sundays is one of the premier outreach events of the College of Arts and Sciences, the academic heart of the university. This series, talk louder? Okay. Sorry, should I start over? Okay. This series covers topics across all of the arts and sciences, including from our colleagues in natural and mathematical sciences, social and behavioral sciences, and the arts and humanities. I'm John Beacom. I'm chair of the Science Sundays Committee, representing several of us from all across the college. Today, we're delighted to welcome Professor Sara Butler from the Department of History, where she is also the director for Center for Historical Research. She's also a member of the Department of Women's Studies and the Center for Medieval and Renaissance History. She's been at Ohio State since 2016. Previous to that, she was a professor at Loyola University in New Orleans. And she is originally from Canada. We will not, however, we will not be serving poutine at the reception afterwards, but we will have coffee and cookies. She is an acclaimed scholar. She's the author or co-editor of several books. She was a recipient of the 2024 Distinguished Scholar Award from the Ohio State University. She is also an acclaimed teacher. She's won several teaching awards. And we are delighted to have her here today, and also you, so let's welcome her now.
I'm just going to get everything settled up here, all the various pieces of technology. Let me start by saying how delightful it is that all of you decided to spend your Sunday here with me, even though it's the first nice day we've had since I don't know when. So thank you. I'm absolutely delighted that you are here. So do we have any Game of Thrones fans here in the audience? Okay. I'm going to try hard not to completely destroy it for you today. I'll tell you in advance, I am also a Game of Thrones fan, okay? I may someday forgive them for season 8. We're not there yet. But yes, it's one of those that I've always really enjoyed. But as a medievalist, I have to say, one of the most frustrating parts is that when watching something like the Game of Thrones, there is so much violence. And it's violence in a very specific way. It is violence as if to suggest that a person can wander around and do whatever they want, including kill whoever they want, and there are no repercussions. You generally don't see trials of any sort in anything about the Middle Ages. That's not what they're interested in showing. People don't get held accountable for what they do. And then occasionally they will have the law step in, but it'll be at the level of a monarch, and they'll just make a spot-on decision, and they'll have some sort of horrific punishment. We'll behead them, hang them, throw them off a cliff. So there's a very definite view of hyper-violence, general lawlessness, but when the law does rear its ugly head, it's extremely violent and, bloodthirsty. There are some problems with this view of the Middle Ages, and that's part of what I want to tackle today. But before I heap too much frustration on Hollywood, I have to make sure that I also blame popular history. I don't know how many of you may have read this book in particular, Steven Pinker's The Better Angels of Our Natures. It was a bestseller for ages. Steven Pinker, I should say, is a Harvard psychologist, not an historian, but he wrote a history. And he wrote a history that has become incredibly popular. Just to give you a sense, Bill Gates, for example, had this on his favorite book of the last decade list. Mark Zuckerberg, it landed on his year of books pick. And it was so popular, he ended up writing a sequel to it called Enlightenment Now. His view of the Middle Ages in this is such an incredibly frightening and horrific view that you're sort of left reading and thinking, how did anybody leave their house in the Middle Ages without expecting to be murdered? It is a pre-Hobbesian, stateless society that he depicts, where everyone is just naturally prone to violence and everything just goes unpunished. It's a really terrifying book. Now, as you can tell, I'm going to try and suggest that some of this view is perhaps not as accurate as it could be. But I think it's also important to understand, first of all, why people like to cling to this view. Someone like Steven Pinker in particular is trying to present a very definite view of history. History that is very much a story of progress. One where we can sit back and say, look at how far we've come. We were such barbarians once upon a time, but look at us now. In his perspective in particular, he sees empathy as basically like this muscle, a muscle that we had, but we didn't know we have. And then suddenly one day we discovered that we could exert some empathy. And we kept practicing it and exercising it. And with time, we got more and more compassionate as a species. And then since the Middle Ages, we've become so peaceful, so compassionate, so caring, that we even care about animals and their welfare. The more you read Steven Pinker's book, the more you start to think we really are good people. It's so amazing. I mean, sure, we could blow up the planet multiple times, but we won't do it because we're so empathetic. He almost had me believing that we don't live in the age of genocide. So there's some problems with a view like that. I certainly see why people like to construct a medieval era that is violent, that is lawless, because it does make us feel better and make us feel like we are constantly progressing. But it's also a very problematic view, and one that I am going to take issue with today and try to give you an alternative view of all of this. Now, I also have to start out by saying I am going to try and give you a revised vision of this, but don't get me wrong, at no point in time am I going to say that the Middle Ages were not violent. Of course they were violent. Have we had a period in history yet where we were not violent? I don't think so. So yes, of course the Middle Ages were violent. The real question is, in a lot of ways, were they more violent than we are now? That is the question that people like Steven Pinker want to ask. That really is being asked as well by TV shows like The Game of Thrones. They very much leave us wondering just how violent we were then and how much better we have gotten as people. Well, I do need to make it clear, first of all, that we really can't measure just how violent we were in the Middle Ages. And part of that comes down to sociologists have a very specific way of measuring violence. It's all based on the number of homicides divided by population in order to give us a rate of violence. So anyone here who knows anything about the Middle Ages, I'm sure is immediately looking up there and saying, we got some problems. Population. For the most part, we really don't have population figures for the Middle Ages. They didn't do things like a national census to figure out how many people were living in a kingdom. That didn't happen. Even when it came to taxation, most taxation was not terribly well recorded because it was a certain percentage of your income. So they didn't bother to pay attention to how much was coming in. We do occasionally get a poll tax, but that was basically a record of every male householder. Well, I suspect there were a lot of other people living in that house with them, especially in an era before birth control. But how many people was that? We have tried to make estimates for the era. We really can't do that. So trying to come up with something like a rock-hard, solid rate is just not something we can do. Let's make things a bit more challenging. Let's look at the records that we have for this period. And I want to give you a good sense of how difficult some of this can be. So when we have a homicide today, I realize most of it is actually on a computer these days, but back in the days when everything was in print, there would be boxes and boxes of files all relating to one case of homicide. You have 2 cases here, and that's all we have about them. Absolutely everything. This is one death. Here is another. And this includes all the information regarding the investigation, the names of all of the jurors, and the outcome. That's it. And as you can imagine, I mean, this is actually pretty beautiful. We have a hole here. Quite frankly, a rat probably ate it at one point in time. This stuff is all animal skin. It's not paper, so it's probably quite tasty. A lot of these records have not survived from the Middle Ages. So when we're trying to make comparisons between now and then, we don't have anywhere near enough records. And the kind of material we have is not really easy to compare. Just to give you a sense, a lot of these records, they don't bother to include what actually happened in the end, the final sentence. And that's because they didn't need to. If the person was acquitted, well, they were no longer in prison. If the person was convicted, they immediately took him out back and hanged him. Why would you bother needing to record the sentence? That's something that often they would have felt was kind of ridiculous. So there are a lot of problems. Because of this, often when people are trying to compare modern records with medieval records, they're comparing modern convictions with medieval indictments. So basically, we're convicting all of these people, even if they were actually acquitted. So my point here is, it is very, very difficult to draw any sort of comparisons for us to be able to say that the Middle Ages was actually much more violent then than it is now. And I have to say, if I had to go by my gut instinct, I would actually say that they were a lot less violent than we are today, which I would love to discuss, particularly during the question period. But one of the things that I do want to start out by emphasizing is this view that the Middle Ages was lawless. Well, it was about as far from lawless as we can get. And in fact, I think that if we were to talk to a lot of people from the Middle Ages, they would have said that they had a lot of unnecessary regulation that they would have been very happy to live without. I also think that if many of us were living back in the Middle Ages, that we would have felt overburdened by the amount of legislation that existed. And I want to give you a little taste of some of the kinds of legislation that they had in that period that we assume they didn't. So they had apparel legislation. It wasn't just that you could get up in the morning and throw on whatever you felt like. No, this was all dictated by law and regulated according to your rank and your annual income. And this has to do with the color of your clothes, how many colors you could wear at one time, the kind of fabric you could wear, what sort of trim, and the acceptability of wearing jewelry, ribbons, girdles, veils, buttons, believe it or not, and mantles. Violating the law risked having your costly, yet socially inappropriate apparel actually confiscated to the crown. In addition, you would have to pay a costly fine as well. So it's something that people thought about quite carefully before they decided to violate these laws. I need to point out that the exact same laws dictated what you were going to eat, how often you could have things like meat or butter or any dairy products, but also how many courses you could have for your meal. I'm going to tell you, they were trying to find a way to restrict how many courses could be expected because the rich were sick and tired of having to have dinner parties with 7 courses. So they used the law to say that the maximum is 2 courses. Yeah. They actually had laws about this stuff. Okay, another one that I love. Many Americans seem to believe that their Second Amendment right to bear arms springs from the Middle Ages, an era when people got out of bed in the morning and strapped on that sword and spent the whole day wearing it, so they walked around perpetually armed to the hilt. Well, that's actually not true. That would be a blatant violation of the Statute of Northampton, which made it clear that the only people who were allowed to walk around armed were the king's officers. Otherwise, if there was a call to arms to defend your village because you were about to be attacked, well, then you were allowed to be armed. But even then, you were only allowed to actually have a weapon that was appropriate to your rank in society. Knights could have swords. Everybody else, you can have an axe or a pitchfork or something nice and cheap like a bow and arrow. But they certainly wouldn't let you wander around with a sword. That was inappropriate. Now, something like hunting, also very much restricted in the Middle Ages. I love in the movies, because in the movies and TV, you always see people saying, I'm hungry. I'm gonna head out and shoot a rabbit for lunch. Okay, you couldn't do that in the Middle Ages because all forests belonged to the king. If you tried to go in there and shoot anything, that's called poaching. It's a crime, and you were going to be executed for it. Instead, the only way that you could actually go hunting was to get a license from the king. Yes, hunting licenses existed as far back as the 11th century. But the king didn't want to let too many people go hunting. He only gave those licenses out to his friends. So sorry, that's another one that you just can't do. Even sports were actually regulated by law. According to the Statute of Cambridge, no one could play football, no throwing or kicking a ball, and no playing dice or casting stones. Sorry, I don't think they had a lot of entertainment in that period. Instead, Englishmen were encouraged to practice the more useful skill of archery so that they might be better prepared to defend England in the event of a foreign attack. And I also need to mention, they had curfews. By 8 p.m. every evening, the bell rang, the curfew bell rang, and everyone was supposed to go to bed. No wandering about, that's definitely a crime. You weren't even allowed to have a fire in your home after 8 p.m. No cooking fires, no home fires. And the point of that was, everybody go to bed. And I should point out, but I did see children present, they also had a lot of rules about what could happen in bed. In fact, there's an entire canon law of sex that spans many, many volumes of books, but I think we'll not get into that in detail. So the point is, this was definitely not a lawless society. They had far more laws than we can even imagine. Sure, we have to deal with traffic laws, but I think this certainly, in some ways, was a lot worse. If you want to wear jeans, you can at least wear jeans. So, let's throw this on a little bit more. Some of the other things that were regulated that I suspect you never would have guessed. Gambling, definitely a no-no. Having a disorderly home. Now that doesn't mean a messy home, that means a disruptive to your neighbors kind of home. Living alone while single. Living with the wrong people while single. Being overly vocal while also being female. We call that being a scold. Being litigious. Selling underweight bread, selling foul-smelling fish, disposing of dung in the wrong place, walking at night, eavesdropping. Who would have guessed that eavesdropping was actually a crime? Now, I should make clear, none of these are going to get you executed. They're not considered felony, nothing like that. But the point is, you could be fined for this sort of behavior. And the whole point of that was to embarrass you and make sure that you didn't do it again. For some of these, they realized that they might well be imposing these kind of fines on people who didn't have any money. So they would strap you to a dung stool and dump you into the nearest pond, ducking you in and out. So not only were you sitting on a toilet, but you were being embarrassed by being dunked into water and having to sit there in wet clothes, sort of like the medieval equivalent of a wet t-shirt contest. So this is the kind of thing that they did to deal with, unruly behavior in a community. But again, this stuff is actually regulated. There are laws written down about all of this. So it really was very much a society that had a lot of law. And in many ways, when you're reading the legislation from the period, it seems a lot more like 1984 than 1384. Very Big Brother-ish. Now, one might be tempted to believe that it didn't matter what laws they had on the books because they didn't have a police force to enforce any of this. My students always seem to know that there was no police force in England until the Bobbies under Queen Victoria. Yes, that is definitely true. There was no formal police force. Because of that, I think that in the medieval era, they actually had to get pretty creative to find ways to implement the laws and enforce them. Because I need to make it clear, just because they didn't have a police force didn't mean that they didn't have ways to convince people to follow their laws. One of the ways in particular that they worked on this was by convincing people to police their neighbors themselves. Now, this is something that they were able to do primarily through ideology. They made it clear that God is offended by sin. And when God is offended, he gets angry. And an angry God unleashes his anger by striking the earth. And the cracks in the earth will then release a miasma. This is foul air. That foul air will make anyone it comes into contact with sick and perhaps even die. And of course, priests were quite happy to tell people that the miasma is caused by God's anger, but it isn't choosy about who it strikes. The miasma doesn't just strike sinful people, it also strikes those non-sinners as well. It strikes anyone in its path. What that means is that if your neighbor is sinful or criminal and you don't do anything about it, you're a really bad Christian. And even worse, your passivity might get you killed. So the best kind of approach to this is to tell everyone, you need to be a good Christian and turn in your neighbors for their sinful or criminal activity. So that's one actually really effective way of enforcing the laws. Another, they also had what's known as tithing groups or frank pledge. Tithing refers to a group of 10. So this is looking at a group of 10 houses. All of the men over the age of 12 in that grouping of 10 houses will be required to police each other, but also they will have to take turns on the rotation of the night watch to guard their houses in the area. So this is another one of those policing each other kind of approaches. Now, it's also called a frank pledge because they had to take an oath of honesty to turn in their neighbors if it was required. So this is one of those forms of policing that is often discounted simply because it was unpaid policing. But I should tell you that any time there was a discovery that these tithing groups knew about a crime and ignored it, they were fined. And they were fined heavily. This is one of the ways that they could be pressed into doing this work, even if they didn't want to. And these fines also accumulated and created a lot of money for the crown. So this is a really important group at actually doing a little bit of self-policing. When it comes to the investigative process, the entire community got involved. If you were sitting in your home or lying in bed and you heard the hue and cry, then you knew that a crime had taken place in your community or somebody had just come across a corpse. And you knew that it was your responsibility to join in with the hue and cry. Now, the hue and cry is basically what it sounds like. It's a lot of people running around and screaming. Sometimes it gets augmented. People are supposed to bring out their drums. If you've got spoons you can play, do that too. Chaucer's Nun's Priest's Tale has a great one where it talks about the hue and cry also includes all the dogs and the cats in the neighborhood barking and meowing in procession as they move from one village to the next. This hue and cry was supposed to include every single person over the age of 12 in the 4 nearest villages. And everybody's supposed to join in with a few different purposes here. I mean, obviously, the hope is if the crime had happened just recently, they might be able to flush out the criminal. That's always a possibility. Or if somebody didn't come out, they would have a sense of who was a potential perpetrator in the crime. They also managed to pass the word around this way. Everybody gets alerted. They know a crime has taken place. Somebody just died. Pass on the word. Be on the lookout. So all of that is helpful. This was also how they got the message out to local authorities that it was time to call for the coroner. So it's a really useful exercise, if a little bit noisy. And once again, this is everybody in the community is supposed to get involved in this one. Now, the medieval coroner is the one who heads up the investigation here to make sure that our laws are actually being implemented and that there's some good law enforcement happening. The office came into existence in 1194 during the time of Richard the Lionheart. And I should say, it certainly came into being in part because the king is the chief peacekeeper in the realm, and he's got a reputation to keep for looking after his subjects. This is absolutely critical. But quite frankly, I think it came into account because of felony forfeiture. Every single time a person was convicted of a felony, not only were they executed, but all of their properties were confiscated. All their movables were confiscated to the king permanently, and then their landed properties were confiscated to the king for a year and a day. And then it went back to the feudal lord who actually owned that property. What this means is that the king made a lot of money off of felons. Every time a crime was committed, then suddenly the king had an opportunity to make money. I feel a certain cha-ching kind of moment every single time they found a corpse. And because of this, it was very important to the king to make sure that they actually found the felon. And in case you're wondering, felony forfeiture is actually something that existed across Europe and was not abolished until the late 19th century. So every single time a person committed a crime and was actually convicted of it, they lost everything, and their family had to support themselves out of the charity of the community. Now, the medieval coroner was important because he had to make sure that the king got his money. But while doing that, he also had to solve a crime. Now, the coroner was always an outsider. There were 4 coroners appointed for every county, and they were knights. So they were generally not people who were living in your average community. So the point was they worked with a group of jurors. We call this an inquest jury, and it was made up of 12 to 24 men who were drawn from the vicinity where the crime had taken place. So just to make this clear, when we say the word jury today, we tend to think of people who come in knowing nothing about the crime and have to have the information hand-fed to them. You need to obliterate that idea from your mind. Instead, the inquest jury was chosen specifically because they believed that these people had some information about how that person had died. Some of them might have been eyewitnesses. Some of them might have heard rumors that were relevant. And because of that, they could help solve the crime. This inquest jury, the group of 12 to 24 men, were the people who were going to undertake the investigation itself. So they were absolutely critical in that they had to know everything possible to be able to help out with this. The inquest itself was a communal event. It took place outside, and it took place outside because, once again, every single male over the age of 12 in that village and the 4 nearest villages were required to attend this inquest. Once again, the point there, if anybody had any information, they would be there. Everybody could hear it, and they could all weigh in with what information they knew to help solve this crime. Now, I'm also going to say the requirement is that all men over the age of 12 attend this. It doesn't say anything about women. In general, women are not really part of the legal system. But I can tell you from the kind of evidence that comes forward, I think every woman and child was also at these inquests because they didn't have TV or the movies and there wasn't a lot else going on. And usually this was the most exciting thing that had happened to them in ages. And surely they also cared about the person who had died. So this is very much a communal event where they expected everyone to be there and everyone to participate. And because of this, the job of those inquest jurors essentially was to find people who were present at the inquest and start asking them questions. They would divide them up into groups and submit each group to a series of questions. Now, we also have a sense of what they asked. We have the statute called the Office of the Coroner from 1276-77, way after the actual creation of the position, but that's normal. In England, they usually have the statute come a lot later than the actual change in law. But this tried to enumerate what kinds of questions they were to ask, just to give us at least a sense of what they had to think about. So we know, for example, that they wanted to know, the inquest jury wanted to know from the people that they were asking, if they knew who was guilty. Could they identify the person? Did everybody just know? If not, who was present at the death? They wanted to know not only who was present, but whether or not that person could speak, and were they capable of discretion? I think that's an important point to make, that even in this early era, the 13th century, they already realized that there were some people who were mentally unsound to the point that they could not be held accountable for the crimes that they committed, or that they could not stand as witness because they were not reliable with their witness testimony. They also wanted to know, the law also wanted to know where the person was slain, whether this was in a house, a field, a bed, an alehouse, or at a company. And could the jurors identify the slain person? Did they know his family? Where did he lay the night before the homicide? All of these questions lead us to believe that they were trying to do their best to retrace the victim's steps, to try and get a sense of where that person was in the 24 hours before the homicide had taken place, in the hopes that someone would be able to pipe up with some information about perhaps a disgruntled argument that broke out that might at least give some clues as to who a perpetrator might be. Now, this very same statute also tells us that they were supposed to do a very careful investigation of the crime scene. They wanted to know a number of different things. In particular, was that person killed at that location? Or is it possible to find horse prints or cart tracks that might suggest the person was killed elsewhere and had to be brought there in a vehicle? Is it possible to find footprints? This is also really important in an era where most people owned one pair of shoes. So actually, matching a pair of shoes up to footprints was a heck of a lot easier than it is today, where we all seem to own like 20 pairs of shoes. They also wanted to look for broken branches, because if the perpetrator had fled, they wanted to know what direction he had fled in to see if they could actually find a trail. And in particular, had the weapon that was used in the homicide been left behind? Now, this very same statute also recommends examining the body. Now, I do have to point out, the medieval English did not do autopsies. When we look at this on the internet, I have to say the medieval church always gets blamed. They say the church didn't want anyone doing autopsies because God made our bodies are a temple, and we're not supposed to desecrate them. Okay, that's not even remotely true. I just point that out because it's actually a very, very common thing to find on the internet. The church actually was completely fine, not only with cutting up bodies, but boiling them down and getting rid of the flesh so that the bones could be distributed. And to think about this, you just have to remember St. Thomas Aquinas' head is coming on tour this year in the US. It is a celebration of the anniversary of his death. No, they were totally fine, because with saints in particular, they were always being chopped up and distributed among various churches. They didn't have any problem with that at all. This is actually an English thing, but also a Northern European thing. And it has a lot more to do with ideas about the separation of the soul from the body. In the north of Europe, they were absolutely convinced that the soul, after death, took a long time to leave the body. It could take 6 months to a year to actually leave the body. So they didn't want any sort of autopsy, because anything done that quickly might actually end up injuring the soul. So they were doing autopsies in the south of Europe in this period, where they thought body and soul instantaneously separated at death, just not in the north. But even if they weren't doing autopsies, they still were doing an awful lot with the body that we don't expect. So this statute, for instance, suggests, well, let's roll the body around, roll the body over and over around so you can look for bruising. You can look for ligature marks. You can look for wounds. If you do find wounds, you want to measure those wounds, measure the length, breadth, and depth of them. They actually use candlesticks to measure the depth of the wounds, in case you're wondering. The purpose of that was that if they did find an axe blade dripping blood, they would then be able to hold it up against the wound and see, is this the weapon that was actually used to kill the person? Is it the murder weapon? They also had to figure out which was the mortal wound, which may not sound important, but if you have a group of people who have attacked a person, they need to be able to figure out which one cast the mortal blow that actually killed this person, because the other people are guilty of assault. That person is guilty of homicide. So they need to be able to figure out which one was the most dangerous. They also suggested that you need to look for ligature marks around wrists to see if perhaps it had also been a robbery, and around the neck to see if the person may have been hanged elsewhere and brought in. They also, and I always thought this one was quite impressive, they said that if you find a corpse that is in the water, then somebody has to sit on its chest, because they need to make sure whether that person actually drowned. And if the person did drown, then the lungs, of course, would be filled with water. Sitting on the chest would expel the water from the lungs. If the person sat in the chest and no water came out, then that was simply a person who had been killed elsewhere and the body was tossed into the water. So they're taking all sorts of things into account and requiring people to do a fairly thorough investigation of the crime scene, but also of the body. Now, I have to say, I think a lot of this is quite impressive, in large part because we have a tendency today to assume that they're going to bring in some sort of medical practitioners to get all this stuff figured out. Well, I will say that in particularly complicated cases medically, it looks like the person who put together the jury, usually the bailiff or the constable from the area, tried really hard to get a barber and put the barber on the jury. Now, I know you don't think of your local barber as your local surgeon, but they certainly did in this period. Barbers had sharp implements. Sharp implements are great for cutting your hair. They are also great for pulling out a rotten tooth and for doing some minor surgery. And in particular, doing a lot of bloodletting is what they spent a lot of time doing. But they would try and put a barber on some of these really complicated cases with the assumption that, at least they knew a little bit about the body. But for the most part, the people who were sitting on these inquest juries were just laymen, just regular people. And yet they were asked to make some pretty difficult decisions, I would say, when it comes to medical circumstances. And just to give you a sense, we have them at times making comments about internal injuries, particularly when it comes to the depth of wounds. They would say, this wound has reached all the way to the brain, halfway through the body to the bowels, or it penetrated the intestines. So they're really digging around quite a bit to see how bad these are. Coroner's reports mention broken bones, not only in situations where the bone was protruding from the skin, and yes, they do mention that quite a bit. They were also clearly feeling around for bone fragments underneath the skin and examining the angle at which a bone lay. There are other entries that speak to internal injuries that, again, I think are pretty impressive. I found one case, for example, from 1393 of a man named Richard the Brewer. He was completely drunk, wandering over to his friend's house while dragging a bag of malt. And while he was climbing up the stairs, he stumbled and fell backwards. And in doing so, the jury concluded that he ruptured his bowels and his diaphragm. Once again, I have to say, that's pretty impressive for a group of people who weren't permitted to do an autopsy, and we're doing a lot of this by feeling around on the outside of the body. Now, some of the most challenging cause of death situations were those when it began as an assault, but the person died. Now, these will often be cases where we're told the person was hit in the head during an assault, but after the assault ended, the person was still alive and went home and went to bed. And the next morning woke up with a headache. And that headache just didn't go away. And a couple of days later got a fever and then died. Well, that's a tough one. I mean, we can sit here and say, geez, it sure sounds like that wound ended up causing his death. But are you certain about that? What happens when that kind of thing happens and there's a pandemic of sorts on the go, or there are a lot of people who are sick? It could just be that the person got the flu and died, and it just happened to be close to the assault. So they have to spend a lot of time looking at these wounds and trying to figure out if it looks like it's the kind of wound that actually would have killed the person. So these kinds of things, they tell us an awful lot about the work that inquest jurors did. Now, I'm going to say that some of the cases that are actually most challenging this way and tell us just how hard they were working is when we have an assault on a pregnant woman, causing her to miscarry. This is actually what they call abortion in the Middle Ages. One of the most difficult questions that they had to come up with is whether or not the fetus was alive while in the womb. This is important because if the fetus was actually alive, then that constituted homicide as opposed to just assault on the woman. They did not believe that life begins at conception. Instead, they were very clear that life happens after the fetus is fully decked out with limbs, has, all 4 limbs, is a fully formed body, and at that point, God will reach in and insert the soul. This will be felt by the mother as the first fetal movements. So we know that's probably like at the end of the first trimester or beginning of the second trimester. But how do you figure that out when you're a group of men and you're completely alienated from the birth process, because men had nothing to do with childbirth in this era, and asked to essentially just look at a fetus? I mean, that is something that is not very easy, and I think we have to have some respect that they were trying their best there in these situations to figure it out. Now, they also often had to try and prove whether or not there was a causal connection between the assault and the miscarriage. And once again, we do know that they were looking quite closely at the fetus itself. I'm not going to go into details here, but there are often times where they're suggesting there may have been broken bones or bruising on the fetus, which again tells us that they were taking their jobs very seriously and trying their best, even though they didn't have any training, to actually figure out what happened. Now, I also want to note, sometimes the body of the victim itself acted as a witness. And this is one of those things that we don't expect. But they knew very well that if the perpetrator of a crime, if a killer approached the corpse of his victim, of course the body was going to bleed. Murder will out, as Geoffrey Chaucer tells us. This is one of those situations where the soul that has not yet left the body can speak when the body is no longer able to do so. The soul will bleed to prove that that actually is the murder that has come close. And if you can see, this is what is happening here. This is called cruentation, ordeal of the buyer. They will actually bring the person they believe accused to come close to the body. And if the body starts shedding blood, then they know that they have caught their killer. They don't do this in the south of Europe at all. It's purely an English thing. Now, I should say, what happens next? So I want to make it clear that inquest juries, they mostly were able to figure out who had actually carried out the crime. Sometimes they would end up blaming it on strangers to the community. I will say strangers were universally hated in the Middle Ages. We have mostly small communities. They did not like it when there were people coming through town that they didn't know them. And actually, strangers always had to get permission to stay in somebody's house, and that person would then, guarantee their good behavior while they were staying there. But they do occasionally blame these things on strangers, and I think sometimes that was just because they didn't want to actually say who did it. But generally, they could figure out who it was. Now, granted, I think it's also important to note, and this goes back to the idea that the Middle Ages were also an era that when they actually did decide to intervene at the level of the law, it was always really bloody. Except when we do look at those records where we actually have them list acquittals and convictions, we discover that the acquittal rates were more like 80 to 85%, which is really high. Today, we do not have acquittal rates like that. We have conviction rates that are higher than that. And there's a good reason. Historians would argue that most jurors in this period were sitting back and saying they weren't really sure that execution was the penalty that fit the crime. Even when it comes to homicide, often they could sit back and say, well, it was a fair fight. Maybe he doesn't deserve to be killed for it. Now, they didn't have anything like time served in this period. But you could certainly have jurors say, this person did spend 4 years sitting in prison waiting for this trial to come up. Maybe we should just acquit him and say that's enough. And it seems like that is what happened, because we have very few executions that actually took place in this period. But I'm not going to leave you with such a peaceful view. When they did feel someone needed to be executed, that's when they went all out. So, David ap Gruffydd, he was a traitor, sort of. He was a Welsh rebel who raised a rebellion against Edward I when Edward I tried to assert his lordship over Wales. So when they caught David, they made sure that they could punish him in as many ways as possible. So this is one of those executions where they were determined to make an impact on all those people who watched it. So for example, he was drawn to the site of execution for treason. That means being dragged, as you see this man being dragged behind a horse to the site of the execution. He was then hanged for homicide, but not long enough that it actually killed him. They wanted him still alive. He then was disemboweled for sacrilege. So they pulled out his bowels and burned them before his eyes. Sorry to the children in the audience. Then they beheaded him and quartered him for compassing the king's death. I don't know if you guys know what quartering means. That means tying each limb to a horse and sending the 4 horses off in different directions so that the body was torn to pieces. Then to make sure that nobody thought, after watching all that treason was still a good idea, they would then take the body parts and put them on poles and post them in areas where that person had worked at raising rebels for his cause. Just a nice little reminder to everybody that it's not good to be a traitor. So, where does this leave us with our talk? I would have to say, this leaves us answering a few things. So, were the Middle Ages violent? Of course. Was the era more violent than today? We have absolutely no way of proving that. We can certainly say that there were some kinds of violence that they tolerated that we would find appalling. I am very thankful that I don't have to walk by a post with anybody's head sticking out of it. That's really nice. But at the same time, they couldn't even imagine our capacity for violence. And all you have to do is think of, the bombing that's going on in Gaza, for example, or in the Ukraine, or I think there's so many different places we could mention at the moment to realize that we certainly have the capacity to be a lot more violent than they did. Were they lawless? Well, absolutely not. Was the law overly harsh? Only when they needed to make a point. And I'm going to leave it there.
Okay, let's take some questions. And is this on? Okay, let's take some questions. And as per usual Science Sundays rules, if there are any younger people in the audience, pre-college students or college students, we'll give them a chance first. but right at the moment I can't see a thing. Let's
Over
see.
here.
Okay, there we go. Just shout it out and then she'll repeat it.
Hello. So during the presentation, you stated that the Middle Ages was actually like less. You would say that it would be less violent.
You want me to elaborate on that?
Yeah, totally.
Okay, so the question is, I suggested during the presentation that the Middle Ages, in some ways, was less violent. So I have to say that I think there's a lot of violence today that, first of all, we expect somebody else to take care of. If we see something going on, we think someone should call the police. We don't step in to do anything ourselves. Now, granted, the person probably has a gun. I'm not stepping in. So I get that. This was certainly not the case, though, in the Middle Ages. There is the expectation that if you saw something bad happening, you were required to step in and help out. And I'm going to give you a scenario here. Domestic violence. So today, if you live on one side of a duplex or live in an apartment building, you may occasionally hear things on the other side of that wall where you're left thinking, I don't know what's going on over there. There's a lot of yelling. I hope there's no violence. When do I get involved? Most of the time we're left thinking that's a private matter. It's not really something that we should step in unless things seem to get completely out of control. The medieval period didn't feel that way at all. They thought that something like marriage was very much a public issue. And if you remember, in this era, it was everybody's responsibility to help a couple to get together. So if you're helping a couple to get married, well then don't you have some sort of responsibility to supervise that marriage afterwards? We have tons of records in this period of the neighbor popping over saying, I heard fighting, what's going on? I'm purposely stepping between the couple. So there are a lot of issues like that where people felt it was their responsibility to intervene. Now again, I think it helps that generally we have smaller communities in the Middle Ages. Today we feel a lot more anonymous. The other thing is, medieval Europe was an extraordinarily Catholic society. And you know what? Their Catholic views were very communal. If I'm going to be saved, it's only because you're saved, and you're saved, and you're saved. This is a joint venture. So I have to care what's going on with my neighbors. If my neighbors are doing things that I feel are a little bit risque, if my neighbor, for example, I look over one evening and there's a pair of shoes out front of that house and I don't recognize those shoes. You know what? I don't care if it's midnight. I'm going over there to see what happens. Because I want to be saved, and I can't be saved unless you are saved, and you were saved, and you were saved. So people got in each other's business a lot more. And when you get into people's business more, I think that you can stop some violence. Having said that, I'm also going to say I think that there was some violence they tolerated that we'd be uncomfortable with. Hitting our kids. Yeah, we today think that's wrong. And I think that's a good thing. Let's keep that up. But we also need to recognize that's still a relatively recent thing. I hate to say it, when I was a kid, getting hit with a wooden spoon still happened. And that hurt, by the way. It's one of those things that, we have changing ideas of what is violence over time. That was a good question.
Right next to the first questioner, go ahead.
What crimes usually resulted in death? And what were the ways of death in the Middle Ages?
Okay, so when you say death, you mean execution? Yes. Okay, so the question is what crimes resulted in execution and what methods of execution did they actually use? So these are felonies would actually result in execution. So treason, homicide, grand larceny, which is usually like cattle theft in this period, something really big like that. Rape was a possibility, but I am going to be honest, it is pretty hard to find a case of rape that actually ends up with anybody being executed. And way too often they end up marrying the rapist. That's a whole other uncomfortable situation. Counterfeiting money is another one, or counterfeiting the king's seal. In England, people are usually executed by hanging. This is not true if you are a member of the nobility, because they thought that hanging was a very undignified kind of death. I'm going to get gross just for a moment, sorry about this. But today when we hang somebody, we do a quick drop and it breaks their neck. So it's a really fast process and painless. In this era, they had not developed the drop. Instead, they pulled you up. So you slowly strangled, and it could take up to a day for a person to actually die. And during that process, you lost control of your bowels and your bladder, which is, again, totally undignified. The eyes would bug out, the tongue would turn black. All of these things were seen to be so completely undignified, you could not do that to a member of the nobility. So members of the nobility got to have their heads chopped off. Much more dignified. Now, I will also say, if we have something like heresy is also something, it's a church crime, but it can be punished with execution. Then they burned your body. They burned your body in case you were diabolically possessed. They wanted to make sure to get the demon out. Yeah. Does that satisfy some bloodthirstiness? Yes.
Okay, there's a question over here. Go ahead.
What was the process of initiating litigation for something like a coroner's inquest? Would that be a writ? Was that just something for like a mezzanine? How was that process occurring?
Okay, the question here is, what is the process for initiating something like a coroner's inquest? Coroner's inquests generally come about by, quite frankly, there's a first finder. I'm walking along. Oh, what's that? I walk into a corpse. I am now the first finder officially at law. So then I have to run around and do that screaming and everything. That's what happens with the coroner's inquest. But I will tell you there are other ways to initiate accusations like this. So for example, if there's a crime that has happened and maybe it is actually something like a rape. I think that's a good example here. A person could appeal somebody else. Appeal in this period is a private accusation. I could actually privately accuse someone by going to the coroner and saying, this is what happened to me. Then they will bring in some matrons to check me out and see if it seems like my accusation is plausible, and then the case will go to trial. And I will say that in cases where there is a private accusation, if that person sticks through the process the whole way, there's a very good possibility that person is actually going to be executed. Because in those situations, they figure if the victim or the victim's family is so determined to stick with the process, because it's not a very easy process, there's a lot of days you have to show up, then, you know, it's definitely a case where that person probably deserves it.
Go ahead.
So you talked about the no fires after 8 p.m.
Yes.
And I get that for like curfew, but what happens in the wintertime? It is cold in the north of Europe.
Yes, it is. So, sorry, the question here is, after 8 p.m., there are no fires. What happens in winter? It's cold in the north of Europe. No, I know they actually don't sleep in the hearth room anyways. The English sleep in longhouses in this era, where the middle room is the hearth room where you do most of your cooking and living. There's a bedroom for the entire family with a bed in it at the other end. And I think basically it comes down to, if you're all sharing the same bed, we've got a lot of body heat going around. And let me also highlight then, children, that means you're sleeping with your parents. They didn't have a lot of privacy in that era. I don't know how they had as many children as they did. Yes.
Further questions? It's hard for me to see. Go ahead, sir.
Yeah, what are the dates for the Middle Ages?
Okay, the question is, what are the dates for the Middle Ages? Roughly 400 to 1500, but I am going to say I generally look at 1100 to about 1500. That early stuff is a little challenging.
What if someone was a nobility, was the inquest different for them?
Okay, that's an excellent question. The question is, if someone was a member of the nobility, was the inquest different for them? Absolutely. The idea that the wealthier you are, well, you really shouldn't be going through the same process as everyone else. Yeah, that's definitely the case in this period. Let's remember that Magna Carta guarantees that everybody should be tried by a jury of their peers. So if you are a member of the nobility, there is no way you should be tried by a bunch of peasants. Completely unacceptable. So instead, your case would go through to Parliament. Parliament in this period was not just about making legislation. They also acted as a court for trials, which quite frankly makes Parliament records way more interesting to read then than they are now.
Go ahead, sir, near the front, yeah.
And I was going to ask about records in general, like how numerous are there, or where would you typically find, like maybe different parts of England you'd find more or less? And nowadays, like what are some of the prominent universities to study those records?
Okay, these are all great questions, and this is about records, where do we find them, etc. So I am going to say, like, this is an example of one of the kinds of records that I use. I should note all of this stuff is in Latin. It's all handwritten. We don't have the printing press until almost the end of the medieval period. It's also all abbreviated. It's done in a shorthand. One of the things that they often do, for example, why bother using vowels? We all know they're there. Just use consonants. This stuff, it's a bit challenging to read. I will actually say there are millions and millions and millions of records. Many of these have not been looked at. I'm not going to say not since the Middle Age, but I think often not since the Victorian era. And a big part of it is there are not that many of us in the world who can read these. And I'm going to say, for all of you who have children who can't read cursive handwriting, we're just getting one more step away from being able to teach people to read this sort of stuff. It is quite difficult to learn to read it. Now, I will say, most of this stuff is kept at the National Archive when it comes to King's records. We do have local record offices in every county as well, but they don't have anywhere near as many records. But if you do go online at some point in time to the National Archives in England, it's out of Kew, Surrey. It's a fantastic website. They actually have paleography tutorials. Paleography is how to learn to read this handwriting. So they have great lessons on how to read this sort of stuff. Now, when it comes to where are the best places to study this, finding a professor who actually can read this and going to work with them, which means chatting it over with a medievalist to figure it out.
Let's take just two more questions. Go ahead, sir.
Have they started applying AI to these yet?
Oh, this is an excellent question. Have they started applying AI to these? Yes, they have. So far, it's really not very good, but I feel like it is going to get there. This is really important because, quite frankly, the number of us who can read these, we are starting to die out. I don't want to suggest I'm a dinosaur, but there aren't a ton of us in the world. So yes, having some sort of a machine program that could read these is fantastic. They've practiced on 17th century English handwriting and gotten it down to like 98% correct. But for some reason, the medieval Latin seems to be a bit more challenging. But at this point in time, they're at about 75% correct, which means that at the very least, the programs that they are working on, they can give me a write-out of what the computer thinks this is, and then I can just go fix it. Now, that's also, though, because I happen to be good buddies with the person who's working on this. It's still a private program. It hopefully will be out sometime within the next 15 years. Slow process, but it's getting there, and that'll be really nice because I can't wait till this stuff becomes more accessible to people. And this is the thing, I will say, this is my photo. This is not from the internet. Because one of the other problems is most of this stuff has still not been digitized. I have to go to England every summer to look at this. And thankfully, in the last 8 years, they've allowed me to take photos. Before that, I believe they thought I was stealing the soul of the documents or something. I don't know. They wouldn't let me take pictures. But yes, we've got a long ways to go, but I feel this is good.
Wait, let's take one last question. Was there one in the back? Let's see, ma'am in the back? Yeah.
Was there any sort of training or experience that the coroner had to have to be selected? Or because you're a knight coroner.
You had to be rich. Sorry. The question is, what kind of experience did you need to be a coroner? I know we often sort of sit back and think, you know, coroner, either medical practitioner or lawyer. No, not for this period. Instead, the assumption was what a coroner needed, he could hire. The whole point was rich people were above being corrupt. That might be a good place to leave things.
Okay, so we have a reception upstairs in the traditions room with a chance to get a cup of coffee and talk to Professor Butler and talk to each other, also have a cookie. By the way, do you have a blog?
I do have a blog. Thank you for asking. It's almost as if that was planted. I do have a blog called Legal History Miscellany, and if any of you are really excited about this, there are great, very accessible to those outside the field articles to read on there. And if you were to look me up, Sara Butler, in the OSU biography page that I have, it's got a link to it right there.
And then last thing is, we have a bunch of people who've maybe never been to one of these events before who are not on the mailing list. If you're not on the mailing list, I encourage you to join. Just Google Ohio State Science Sundays. You sign up, you get like 1 email a month, and then you find out about events like this. So let's thank the speaker again. And see you, Peter.